All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to have a little brief introduction of the format for today. My name is Mike Graham. I'm going to be helping to coordinate today's speaker. I want to remind everyone that I have ultimate control, so do not try to turn on your videos or your microphones. Just enjoy what's going to be an amazing talk and sit back. And when we are all done and go through questions, please raise your hand electronically, and I will unmute you and turn your video on so that you can ask a question for the speaker. And then I will drop your hand and we can get others to talk as well. So I want to welcome everyone to our Thursday seminar series at Moss Landing Marine Labs. This is a fun one. Not very often do I get to introduce somebody that I've known literally for decades, which is pretty cool, especially given how young she is. It just tells you how long we've been interacting. Today's speaker is Dr. Anne Salomon. She has been working in systems similar to mine for a long time, and we have a lot of colleagues in common since she started her work. She got her bachelor's out at Queen's University and did her master's in seaweeds at University of British Columbia, and then moved on to get her PhD at the University of Washington with one of our all-time favorite people, Bob Payne, and then Dr. Jen Rusink. And that's kind of where I really got to interact with Anne. You know, she does a little bit of everything. She's always got fishing and exploitation and marine management on her mind. She is a kelper, whether she says so or not. She's been working in some of the most glorious kelp forests on the planet. She's got a weird fascination with these little fuzzy creatures called otters that others find highly charismatic and are critical to issues with trophic cascades and marine predation, et cetera. And it's all great stuff. And it's just really fun watching Anne and her systems that she's been studying. And I just got to say, as you know, she's now a professor at Simon Fraser University. She's she's a full professor, at Simon Fraser, and she runs the Coastal Marine Ecology and Conservation Lab. And you know, I've talked quite a bit about Anne in the past few years. And when they ask me why I get so excited about the work she's done, you know, I say generally that she's just one of my favorite humans. And it really matters because when you hear Anne speak, you get humanity. What she does is she brings humanity to her science, and she brings her science to humanity. And it's just always been super fun. So I am super excited to hear her talk today. And the title is Expanding Our Models of Nature and Modes of Science for a Safe and Just Future. Take it away, Anne.
Wow, Michael, thank you so much for such a generous introduction. And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's a real honor and it's a privilege to spend the next hour or so with you. So let's get started. Today, what I want to do is I want to take you on a dive back through time. And I want to do that because I want to get us all to rethink some of our fundamental assumptions that we hold about how coastal ecosystems work so that we can reimagine our relationship with them in the future. So I'm going to take you back around 10,000 years ago when people really did travel by canoe along vast aqueous highways of temperate reefs dotted with kelp forests and productive shellfish beds. A mosaic, if you will, of diverse habitats that were used, but also created and stewarded by people. So today in my talk, people are my protagonist, not urchins, not kelp, not rockfish, not ocean temperature or pH, but people. And as Michael said, I guess the reason that is the case is because I do fundamentally think that if we're going to start navigating towards ecologically safe and socially just operating space for humanity, that we really need to be thinking in marine science and in ocean policy about people as fundamental components of nature. And that means that we need to start expanding our conceptual and our quantitative models of nature, and we have to change the way that we do our science. So take, for example, a kelp forest and kelp forest food webs. Now, marine ecologists, such as myself, are classically trained to study usually unidirectional interactions between specific species in these kelp forests. So, for example, the cascading effects of predators, be they sea otters in the North Pacific, or lobster in California and sheephead wrasse, or even snapper in northeastern New Zealand. These are classic indirect effects of trophic cascades. We know they cause these alternative states, and we have done a lot of work on this paradigm. We have uncovered all sorts of nuances, and it is amazing. And I myself have worked in all of these places on this very set of interactions. And yet, one of the key deficits of the way we tend to look at kelp forests and these interactions is that we rarely consider humans as keystone species in these trophic interactions. And instead, usually how we conceptualize people is as external to a system and as negative disruptors. So this is typically how in our mental schema of people and ecosystems and interactions, we tend to think of people. And as a result, if we want to maintain productive, resilient, and biodiverse ecosystems, the general sense is that we need to preclude people from it. Today, what I want to do is I want to present an alternative mental schema to this, one where people are considered embedded components of social systems that interact reciprocally with ecosystems and governance systems. And many of you probably know that these are increasingly being called social ecological systems. So we know these systems are often perturbed by all sorts of disturbances, like climate instabilities, national market volatility, all sorts of policies at multiple levels of government, and also slowly changing social norms and values. And because of these disturbances, we also know that it's practically impossible to try and manage the system to a steady state or specific targets like target abundance for the recovery of an endangered species or a certain biomass of fishery, given the dynamic nature and these perturbations that continually happen. And instead, what we're realizing is that what management ought to try and sustain is the relationships within this system. Now, of course, I'm trying to forward the slide and it's not forwarding, but it does say relationships. Okay, let's try forwarding. It's not forwarding. Interesting. There we go. Just took a little time. Maybe it's the connection from Canada. Okay, so I think it's great actually that just happened, because if there's one thing I would love for you to take from this talk is the importance of thinking about the persistence of relationships rather than specific components of this dynamic system. And ironically, while we're starting to increasingly recognize the role of people in these systems, we're also, as scientists, starting to recognize our role of generating and sometimes institutionalizing inequities among people. We're starting to realize the systems of power that influence the kinds of questions we ask, the data we view as legitimate, the people that are involved in scientific processes, and ultimately who benefits from the science we do. So take, for example, fishery science. Fishery science tends to use accepted models of nature and very specific management outcomes that are pretty well established and objectives. They tend to very rarely consider issues of equity and justice, and instead focus on pretty established management options, run scenarios, and try and inform predictively the results of a kind of portfolio of different management solutions. What we're realizing increasingly is that there's a strong feedback between colonialism and the various characteristics of colonialism and fishery science, such that the very elements or drivers of colonialism are reinforced by the tools, the scientific tools and approaches in fishery science. Now, this is the case for marine science generally, and I would probably put forward generally many of the natural sciences. And it's something I think that a lot of scientists now are increasingly reckoning with. The third thing I want to bring up, and then I'm going to come to some solutions. If my slides advance, it's a little sticky here. There tends to be a big gulf between the science that we do and the impact that we want to achieve out on the water or under the water. So today I want to propose to you the theory of change that I think we should start thinking about as scientists. And it sounds like it's happening in California. And that's the importance of democratizing science so we can actually amplify our impact and make the work we do more equitable. So as scientists, we have a sphere of control. We can influence how we do our science. And what I want to put forward today, and I'm going to show you some examples coming up, is that if we co-design our research, if we co-produce it, and we co-deliver it with people outside the academy, then we're more likely to have an impact. And what that means is that we jointly frame problems, we collaboratively identify where the gaps of our knowledge lie, we design and propose research together, we weave sometimes very diverse and sometimes conflicting knowledge systems, which is where a lot of insight often happens. And then when we actually come up with results and grow the knowledge collectively, we mobilize it together. And of course, it's an iterative process. So that's something that we can control. And that's a part of science where I think, the way we do it, the approaches we take, we can really be very mindful and thoughtful there. Because ultimately, what we're interested in is influencing these outcomes outside of our control. So if we do research co-design and co-production, we're more likely to change the knowledge, the relationships, the skills, the behaviors of people. And then that is more likely to change the policies and the practices of organizations. And that's when we can actually get true transformation in systems. Those are outcomes that we can influence. And ultimately, what we want to do, if we want to achieve the impact outside of the university, is actually realize those benefits, be they environmental change, social or economic change. So that's my big framing for this talk. And what I want to do is now share with you 3 examples of the work we've done up in BC, my students and I, out of SFU, with many partners, mostly on the west coast of British Columbia, and then some of the most glorious kelp forests and nearshore ecosystems in the world. I'm biased, and it's all through knowledge co-production. I'm going to share with you 3 examples. First off, I'm going to talk about kelp forest regime shifts today, but also in deep time. We're going to talk about the resilience of intertidal kelp harvest, and then I'm going to talk to you about the magic of ancestral clam gardens. So this is our roadmap for the talk, and we're going to start off with kelp forest regime shifts. Now, many of you know that there's a lot of evidence buried in the ground, archaeological evidence, that suggests that people came to the Americas at the end of the Pleistocene, and it was highly likely some of the most productive ecosystems, coastal ecosystems on our coast, like kelp forests, that sustained some of the earliest coastal migration routes to the Americas. And it's fondly known as the kelp highway hypothesis. Some of you have probably been involved in some of these publications, suggesting that it was these ecosystems that actually fueled a lot of this travel, up to 14, now it's pushing probably 16,000 years ago. And what that means is that when I look at a kelp forest photograph like this, I think about it in terms of the longevity of human interactions with that kelp forest. In British Columbia, at least, there's evidence of 14,000 years of interactions. So what these really are coupled social ecological systems. That changed dramatically with some of the earliest colonizations to our coast. In British Columbia, that would have been around 1774 and 1778 with Captain Cook, 74 with the Spanish. And that dramatically changed things. Now, many of you know the story of the functional extinction of this very famous keystone shellfish predator, the sea otter. But many of you might not know that in addition to dramatic ecological changes, like the proliferation of shellfish prey, like these sea urchins, other dramatic things happened. And that includes the colonial dispossession of Indigenous governance and economies. Before colonialism, Indigenous communities had evolved amazingly intricate stewardship practices complex marine tenure systems and trade networks up and down the coast from Alaska through to British Columbia and California. And those were eroded with colonialism. So with the recovery of sea otters today, heralded as a modern conservation success story, because it really truly is, comes incredible conflict. Here in the paw of the sea otter, you can see northern abalone, Halios campshitcana. In Canada, northern abalone are listed as an endangered species, one of our first invertebrates listed as an endangered species. And so while this is a conservation success story, there certainly are a lot of trade-offs ecologically. It's also an example, however, of a modern policy failure, because right now our Species at Risk Act in Canada, much like the ESA in the US, really does not consider humans as part of this ecosystem. And we know that when otters come back and cause these cascading effects, they trigger these regime shifts. And depending on which regime is occurring on a reef, there are social and ecological costs and benefits. And those costs and benefits depend on your values and your objectives. So in British Columbia, coastal First Nations share prey with sea otters. And as my collaborator and cultural advisor says so succinctly and beautiful, both of these consumers have the right to food. So really, this issue of recovery of sea otters is a conservation success story, but it's also an issue of food justice. And we know that the right to food, this is a recognized international human right. And food justice means that people can have regular access to secure food, that it is sufficient to be promoting a healthy and a dignified life free of fear, and that it's safe to eat and culturally appropriate. So many coastal communities that can't easily get to grocery stores or can't easily drive in their cars for hours on end to get other food sources are really impacted by the depletion of shellfish with sea otter recovery. So this is an example of a large knowledge co-production and knowledge mobilization initiative started back in 2013. We call it Coastal Voices. It is governed by a steering committee of hereditary leaders from the Haida Nation, the Celtic Nation, and New Channel nations, covering almost 3/4 of BC's coast. And our work together aims to weave both Indigenous and Western knowledge systems to inform ocean policies that do a better job reflecting social ecological interactions and the values and objectives and management authority of Indigenous people who are rights holders in Canada. They're not stakeholders, they're rights holders, and some of the original decision makers for several thousand years on our coast. So one of the first set of questions we started asking together as a group was, what did these coupled human kelp forest systems look like in deep time anyhow? And this is work done by a master's student of mine, Erin Slade, in collaboration with archaeologist Ian McKechnie. We dug down and back through time around 6,000 years across several middens. And what we did is we compared mussel sizes in the past and the present. Now, our mental model of prehistoric kelp forests typically tends to assume that sea otters were at carrying capacity everywhere, and there are kelp forests everywhere. And you can just imagine that kelp highway hypothesis with this blanket of canopy kelps up and down the coast. But was that truly indeed the case? Digging again. Here it comes, hopefully. So here's the coast of British Columbia 10,000 years ago. It actually didn't look like this. It looked like this. All of those little dots there are shell midden sites, sites of human settlement. And where there are no dots, it's because there haven't actually been surveys. So remember, an absence of evidence is always not evidence of absence. But what you can see here is our coast was thoroughly occupied by people, much more occupied up and down the coast than it is today, actually. And if you look in these middens, what you're looking at here is the relative proportion of sea otters to other marine mammals. Here, the size of the bubble reflects the relative proportion of sea otter bones. And what you can tell is that in many places, sea otters were hunted extensively. And in the archaeological record, we have no evidence of any, through time, extirpation. There was hunting, and it occurred in a lot of places, mostly on the outer coast. So what did systems actually look like in deep time? To answer that question, we looked at one of the prey of both sea otters and people, California mussels. You probably all know them very well. And we looked at modern mussel sizes at sites up and down the BC coast in the presence of otters and also in their absence. Then we also looked at mussel sizes in deep time, back around 6,000 years in this particular case. And what I'm going to show you here are the sites. This work was done on the central coast of BC and the west coast of Vancouver Island and the tip of Washington State. And we compared these mussel sizes, ancient ones to contemporary ones in places with and without sea otters. In blue there with modern sea otters, in white without. And there's the gray, the ancient sites, ancient mussel size data. And what I'm about to show you are very simple size frequency distributions here on the left, and then size spectra on the right, if the graph comes, there we go, on the south coast and the central coast. And the main take-home message here is that ancient mussel sizes in the past are more similar to modern mussel sizes at sites without sea otters. You can see they're much larger. You see that extension of the size frequency graph, and you tend to get larger mussels in places without sea otters today, and we find those in ancient midden sites. This is a beautiful quote by a colleague and knowledge holder, Peter Hansen, and his wife, Daisy, who say here, "The way our people did it in the past is they kept sea otters away from where we were close by, like all around the islands out there. They hunted them there and kept them off the sea urchin beds. So they didn't take everything. It could be done again." So Indigenous people managed their relationship with sea otters and shellfish intentionally. So what I'd like to suggest is that we need to update our mental model of prehistoric kelp forests. Sea otters close to human settlement sites were probably well below carrying capacity due to both direct mortality and a landscape of fear. And we have strong evidence that through thousands of years, millennia, people coexisted with sea otters, with shellfish, and with kelp. We can tell that from those shell middens. There was highly likely some kind of spatial mosaic of kelp forest patches. And what that means is the actual realized niche of otters is probably pretty different and much smaller than its fundamental niche. What that does is it challenges us all to rethink our mental models of what kelp forests looked like in the past and what recovery measures and objectives should look like today for the diversity of people that use and enjoy and benefit from our coast. So how and when and why and to what extent do these kinds of shifts occur today? And for that, my students and I have been looking at sea otter recovery up and down the coast of the central coast of British Columbia in the recent times. And what I'm going to show you here is work by my previous PhD student, Jen Burt, that looked at 20 sites, and this is a subset of them, 11 sites, from 2013 and 2016. And these are grouped as sites with no sea otters in pink, places where otters just recovered in 2014 in orange, and continuous otter occupation in green. And what you're looking at here is sea urchin biomass. And what the clear pattern shows is that after recovery of otters in that red arrow, you see a very quick decline in sea urchin biomass. And as a result, temperate reefs that looked like this in 2013 at those sites very quickly, within a year, looked like this, where you can see a dramatic spatial increase in the spatial extent in canopy forming kelps. The other thing that took us by surprise that we did not plan during this very large survey effort was sea star wasting disease in 2015. And all of you know very well about this. It happened to you as well, of course, when Pycnopodia sea stars really disappeared, and up to 90% of their biomass vanished literally overnight. So we documented this up in BC And we also documented across all of our sites, regardless of their otter occupation history, an increase in small and medium-sized urchins. And as a result, slight increases in kelp density, even in places with continuous otter occupation. And what that means is that up in BC, at least, Pycnopodia really functions as a pivotal predator up there. Not a keystone per se, but I would say a mesopredator that plays a very important role at hoovering up all small and medium-sized urchins. And so they play an important role in the rate of change in forest regime shifts in British Columbia. Here you're looking at the same data, but essentially as those kind of phase shift diagrams you often see in the literature. This top graph describes the kind of pattern of kelp density as a function of urchin biomass. And I just want to put you guys all over there. Before sea star wasting disease up high and after sea star wasting disease down low. And what you can see is that what were very distinct states before sea star wasting disease became less distinct, in part because of the role, that important mesopredator role of Pycnopodia. But as my colleague Phil Levin says, and it's easy to be interesting, it's much harder to be useful. So how is this information actually useful to the nations that are trying to deal with issues of food security and food sovereignty, given these changing dynamics, these regime shifts? So what Coastal Voices has intended to do is also think a lot about what actually enables adaptation of coastal communities to these dramatic changes when sea otters do recover within these different climate and disturbance contexts. And what we know in BC is that it's very clear, and what we've heard from the nations is that we need to strengthen Indigenous governance authority to deal with these dramatic changes, implement adaptive management plans as experiments to really experiment, monitor, and then change, if need be, what we actually do to make sure we have productive kelp forests and productive shellfish beds. We need to bridge Indigenous Western knowledge and build learning platforms where nations up and down the coast, including our neighbors to the south, can really share their experiences, what they've learned, and their solutions. So what this has involved for us is community knowledge exchanges, where we have brought Indigenous leaders like this hereditary chief, Witsitskum and Mac, from Tokart Bay, west coast of Vancouver Island. No sea otters have recovered there yet. They're on their way. We brought her and her colleagues up to Alaska to talk with the Sukpiaq in Alaska, who've been experiencing sea otter recovery since the 1950s, and where they actively hunt sea otters and seals and still have that tradition as a very much part of their culture. We're also trying to democratize the quantitative models we use to understand the different kinds of management options that are available out there. So this is work led by now a PhD student of mine, Hannah Kobluk, and advisor K.L. Juice, where we've been spending a lot of time with Indigenous leaders that are also traditionally some of the key knowledge holders, and identifying what their management objectives are, and given their knowledge, what that means for potential different management scenarios. We've been marrying this with what we know about sea otter behavior, given harvest in Alaska, what we know about kelp forest dynamics in British Columbia, and then coming up with spatially explicit patch occupancy models in this particular case that allow us to imagine, as a spatial thinking tool, what would happen if we could create otter-free areas in some places and allow persistent populations in others. Then we can look at model outputs, compare them against social and ecological outcomes that were identified by these hereditary leaders, not just the scientists, that would then allow us to compare alternative management scenarios, and then, of course, inform dialogue again about new management objectives. So this is the way we're actually trying to democratize models of nature and the way we do our science in this case. Okay, so that's kelp forest regime shifts in deep time and today. And now I want to tell you a little bit about kelp harvest in the intertidal for you, all of you intertidal ecologists out there. This is one of my favorite recent projects that my student Hannah led as a master's student, working closely with the Heiltsuk Nation on the west coast of British Columbia, the central coast. And there, Agresia, the feather boa kelp, locally known as yagya, is harvested, and it is put in the water column as a substrate to collect herring eggs. That's what you're looking at right here. And you're looking at a woman named Connie Newman processing herring eggs on yagya. And I can tell you, with a little bit of wasabi and soy sauce, this is delicious, and it is prized amongst this nation and many nations on the West Coast. Now, the Heiltsuk came to us and they said, we want to know if our traditional harvest practices of Agresia, how that actually affects recovery, because there is increasing pressure from outside to commercialize this kelp harvest. And it is very, very dear and near to these communities, and they wanted to know more about their own traditional kelp harvest, what environmental conditions affect the recovery of their traditional harvest practices, and what of their ancestral practices are in fact being used today before they would even consider opening up this harvest to larger commercial interests. And so to answer these questions, we set about a harvest experiment where we harvested some plants and had some controls, tagged a lot of fronds, measured a lot of fronds, and harvested, given the traditional practice of cutting 25% of the plant above the meristem in the spring. And we measured many of the environmental conditions that we thought would affect recovery. Not only that, we also spent a lot of time in community asking people at the request of the Heiltsuk, how much do they actually harvest, and how important do they feel these various environmental factors influence where they actually choose to harvest, and what influences harvest recovery rates or the resilience of individual plants to their harvest. And one of the biggest surprises to me, maybe this wouldn't have been a surprise to you, Michael, and you other phycologists out there, but across all of the sites, if we compared the net biomass of Agresia of unharvested plants and harvested plants, it was amazing that plants actually recovered or exceeded their pre-harvest biomass. And this is because the plants started sprouting new fronds if they were harvested. It's really, really remarkable. This is a slow growing kelp. And in fact, if you look at the percentage of frond lost due to our experiment that had some variation, obviously, in blue, and the natural loss of the control plants, you can see that they were very similar. In fact, the traditional harvest rate in the spring mimicked natural disturbance in the spring when we went back in the summer to actually count the number of fronds lost. And what's also very interesting and important to remember is that the level that we experimentally harvested of these plants was quite conservative, 25%. But when we asked people, how much do you actually harvest? In fact, the self-reported harvest was quite a bit higher. It was up to about 45%. But when we actually counted for the variation in the size of fronds and thus the biomass loss, rather than just the number of fronds, there was more similarity between our experimental harvest, natural loss, and reported harvest. So it really depends on how you're measuring that loss. When we asked what conditions actually alter recovery, we compared local knowledge to our ecological models. So our local knowledge interviews, they were Likert scale interviews where we asked people on a scale of 1 to 7, how important is wave exposure? How important is ambient density of grazers like sea urchins, or ambient density of kelps, temperature, or biomass of kelps around? And we did the same thing. We did this same work, quantifying it in the intertidal. And if you look at the local knowledge expert, what's really what's really interesting is the ranking of local people's perspective on what drives recovery. And here are our ecological models on the right. What you're looking at parameter estimates from generalized linear models, and you're going to see the parameter estimates and their uncertainty. Now I'm revealing them here and their relative importance all standardized to the 0. So if you're on the right and you're far away from that dotted line, you have a strong effect. And if you're closer to the line, it's a weaker effect. If it's on the right, it's positive. It's on the left, it's negative. They're ranked in terms of importance. And what you can see here is this remarkable similarity in the ranking of what we found and what was perceived by local knowledge experts, except when it came to pre-harvest size. And as soon as we talked to local people, it became very clear they only harvest large plants, where we were specifically in our models making sure we're getting a diversity of size plants. So it was truly remarkable to see the congruence between local knowledge expert and our ecological models in terms of what drives recovery. So I want to summarize this little story by telling you some of the key findings here. Essentially, Agresia recovered way faster and greater than we expected. The traditional harvest actually mimicked natural loss. However, plant size mattered. So did sea surface temperatures. In fact, even 0.7 degrees difference across our sites influenced recovery rates. Indigenous harvest practices certainly did promote recovery. The traditional ones of only cutting 25%, but we know that traditional practice is very vulnerable to ocean warming, even a degree of ocean warming. And we also, as I shared with you, uncovered this erosion of traditional practice. People were harvesting more than the 25% self-reported. So these were all really important findings for the nation, guiding their future management plans and decisions about how they wanted to self-regulate their own harvest and the extent to which they were willing to entertain larger commercial harvests of outside interests. All right, and my last story here is going to switch from kelps to soft sediment systems and clams. And I'm going to teach you all about the magic of ancestral clam gardens. Now, usually I ask a crowd, and I can't see you all, but how many people here have heard of clam gardens? Can you put your hands up so I can see? Are you allowed to do that? Or can you do that for me? Is that asking too much? I'm going to assume
Should be all do.
You all know. Okay. Well, that's great. Good. I can do a quick summary then. Okay. You're looking at an ancestral clam garden here from a drone. I like to say it's like an eagle eyes view of a clam garden. And with my cursor here, I'm going to show you intertidal clam gardens. They're rock walls built by people between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago, where people moved rocks to the edge of the low tide around chart datum between just below chart datum and to about a meter above chart datum. And you can see this rock wall at low tide all along the coast here. And what's really neat too is that right behind this rock wall, you see a flat terrace, and above the intertidal, see this light green patch here? This is a indigenous settlement site, several thousand years old, where people lived. There are house platforms here. There are mortuary evidence of mortuary mounds here as well. People lived here for thousands of years and tended to their main food source, this clam garden. And if you jump down onto the rocky point there, this is what it looks like on the ground. There's the rock wall. Here are a whole bunch of archaeologists madly digging. The ecologists weren't in this particular picture, but you can see the flat terrace up here and then the settlement site right above. And these are truly magical places. One of the first questions we thought to ask was, well, how many clams do these clam gardens actually produce? To what degree do they actually boost production? If you build a wall, if it fills in with sediment, both through natural processes and people bringing back sediment to the beach, how many more clams do you get? So to do this, answer this question, we, of course, conducted surveys and an experiment. And what you're looking at here are some figures of non-wall beaches that tend to have a slope and clam gardens that tend to be much flatter. And imagine you're looking cross-shore onto them. In blue here, where we have the non-wall beach, in green, the clam garden. So we know that in intertidal, there's an optimal tidal height where certain species tend to thrive. And when it comes to clam gardens, what we hypothesize they were doing is actually expanding the real estate at that optimal tidal height where clams do very well. And we did a whole bunch of surveys and we did some experiments. And essentially, if you just look at the survey data and just look at, in this case, little neck clam density of different clam lengths from the small individuals to large individuals, green are clam gardens, blue are non-wall beaches, you just tend to see 2 to 4 times the density of little neck clams in clam gardens compared to non-wall beaches. And these are clam gardens that haven't been actively tended for probably close to 150 years. But just the structure alone can create this kind of recruitment, growth, and survivorship success. So we wanted to figure out a little bit more about how these operated. So we turned into clam gardeners ourselves. We collected a whole bunch of clams, tagged them, and transplanted them along that same intertidal gradient I showed you, and let them grow for about 3 to 4 months. And this is what we found. So here you're looking at growth rates of clams as a function of intertidal height. In green, you have the clam garden. In blue, the non-wall beach. And first off, you'll notice that Gaussian fit to the data is much more constriction on the clam garden. And that's because, remember, it's much flatter. So there's less variation in tidal height. It's optimizing that intertidal height. And you can also see that there's a lot of variability, but the growth rates tend to be higher at that intertidal height compared to the growth rates of clams on regular non-wall beaches. Clam gardens grow at least twice as fast in clam gardens compared to non-wall beaches. Pretty remarkable. And that's without tending. If you look at 9 to 10,000-year-old clams, we see evidence of this. So what you're looking at in the top graph here, and by the way, those photographs, those are 10,000-year-old clams collected from shell middens and paleo deposits. In the top graph, you're looking at von Berthelot, the growth curves fit to clams that have clam shells that have been sectioned and their annuli measured. And these L infinity values are one of the parameters from those growth curves through those different time periods from about 10,000 years ago to today. And at around 4,000 years ago, when people started building clam gardens, when this innovation started happening, you can see these higher L infinity values. You also see them declining in contemporary times when people, because of colonization, were dispossessed of their land and from their stewardship practices and no longer tending clam gardens to the extent that they were several thousand years ago. So as one of our knowledge holders, Davy Wilson from the Heiltsuk Nation said back in 2012, we transplanted clams in the clam garden so we didn't have to go very far. That means access. We put gravel in the beach to increase the number of clams. Only certain families owned clam gardens and the whole family would look after them. In this one little quote, we get so much. We have evidence from Davy that transplants happened intentionally. Sediment was actively tended to increase its quality. And we also have evidence of proprietorship. People had proprietorship in certain places and not other places. These are examples of marine tenures that people held and governed with governance protocols and principles for thousands of years. So how do clam gardens actually boost clam production? Well, to answer that question, we started quantifying different qualities of clam gardens. You're looking at one here from the Central Coast around Hakai Pass. This is a massive clam garden. You can see this rock wall here, other rocks that were probably too big to move or made visible with changes in sedimentation. You can see all the rocks that were put up on as kind of armoring up here below the forest. This is a canoe run here. This is a pretty magical place. So we asked this question across replicate clam gardens And instead of just showing you graphs, I want to show you pictures because they just say it all. What you're looking at here in blue is the sediment and sediment fractions we tend to see in non-wall beaches, and in green, the sediment fractions we see in clam gardens. And right away, you can see that the sediment in clam gardens, it's much lighter, it's a lot whiter, and it's much more calcium carbonate rich compared to the darker sediments in the non-wall beaches. You tend to see larger size fractions of coarser sediment, just like Davey said, and much smaller fractions of fine silts. So the sediment qualities are quantitatively different. If you look at temperature, this is also pretty amazing. So what you're looking at here is the temperature profile across the beach and mean temperature in these top graphs here at 3 beaches that are non-walled in blue, 3 clam gardens on the right in green. And we've got temperature loggers from the bottom of the beach to the top of the beach. That's why you're seeing multiple lines. And you're looking at these temperature data from the spring into October. And just looking at mean temperature, especially in the summertime, here's the max mean temperature in the summertime. You can see it gets to up to 16 and a half, 17 degrees. Whereas on clam gardens, it's much cooler, like a degree cooler. And you can see the variability across the garden is much more reduced. If you look at minimum temperatures, take a look at October, September and October, when things start getting really cool up here in BC. You get temperatures dipping really dramatically down on non-walled beaches, less so on clam gardens. So essentially, they're stabilizing temperature extremes, which is a good thing for clam ecophysiology. So to kind of further examine these particular drivers of change we monitored, we again did some more clam farming. We collected and we tagged a lot of baby clams, specifically in this case with the Wewakam Nation, Campbell River and Cape Mudge. And we transplanted them. Here they are in plots where we actually also manipulated sediment quality. They are transplanted in little XR mesh bags. And what I'm about to show you here are the parameter estimates. Now you guys are all pros at these graphs here of all of these drivers of change. And what we could see pretty obviously is that the calcium carbonate concentration on the beaches and the temperature were the 2 factors that really influenced clam growth rates. Remember that doubling of clam growth rates on those clam gardens. So by reducing temperatures in the summer months, the growing season of clams, and by having greater calcium carbonate rich sediment, we tended to get more clam growth. And this is the amazing work of my master's thesis, Natasha Salter, with the Wewakam Nations. So clam gardens can double clam production by really buffering environmental extremes. And today, given the extent of marine heat waves up in the Pacific Northwest, the heat domes we're experiencing, this is a big deal. It's an example of a climate solution. And our lab has exciting results coming out on experiments that have just provided more data along those lines. Now, clam gardens are amazing, but they're not unique. If you look across the Pacific Ocean, there are many examples of ancestral clam gardens. I welcome you all to look at a beautiful website we created a couple years ago called seagardens.net that describe not only the clam gardens that I've just shared with you and their magical features, but also the stories behind the Corrales de Pesca in Chile, octopus houses up around Haida Gwaii, the Loko'ia of Hawaii, and the eel ponds and clam gardens in New Zealand and the eel ponds in Australia. There's so many examples of ancestral mariculture techniques that were designed to enhance the persistence, the resilience, the productivity of the relationships between people and coastal oceans through time. Okay, so those are my 3 examples. I'm about out of time, so I'm going to summarize with this slide. To expand our models of nature and our modes of science, I'd like to leave you with these five key points. First off, I encourage us all to really conceptualize people as components of nature when we're studying them. While we might focus on ecological questions and ecosystems, people are always influencing the system you're studying. And we need to really start putting people in our food web diagrams. And what that means, as soon as we start doing that, is we need to also start restoring the functional role of people rather than excluding people from ecosystems. And in fact, in many cases, that can increase productivity, it can increase biodiversity and resilience of systems. We need to really start, and I'm really grappling with this myself, thinking about the reciprocal interactions. When you get changes in ecosystems, how does that influence other components of nature, including people? And that, of course, suggests the value and importance of considering social ecological systems and even just reciprocal dynamics in the ecological food webs that some of you may be studying. If we're going to democratize science and increase our impact and make it more equitable, we need to really start considering multiple knowledge systems and diverse values and diverse objectives. And then my last point here is when we look back in time, we can sharpen our understanding of the present and our view to the future. And those are my main messages for today. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Anne.
My pleasure.
Awesome. Well, like I said, humanity, you ooze it. And it's just so refreshing to see a talk where it's not a buzzword and it's, really what it's all about. As I told everyone previously, they can raise their hands and ask questions, but I have ultimate control, which means I get asked the first question. And I've been a fan of this story for a long time. And, I think back to my first recollections of when I started hearing about this co-management, this ability for early people to co-manage different resources, the stabilizing action of otter foraging with the immediate need for high nutrition resources that are presumably antagonistic when you create an otter-only system or an otter-free system. That's when they become antagonistic. They become less antagonistic when it's a mosaic. And I've always thought that the story you have is the opposite of the MPA version. The MPA version is we exploit everything and we try to put together these little nuclei that we're trying to connect with dispersal. Your system and your understanding of this ancient system requires dispersal and healthy populations to be the connective source. And all I worry about is climate, because now when climate stresses kelp and it stresses inverts, specifically shellfish, and it threatens these networks of connectivity driven by physiology and recruitment, does it dismantle some of the natural framework that these early people were relying on as they managed it? Does it force you now to make small, let's just say you take this model, you make smaller areas where you manage the otters, because you can't do it over longer areas anymore, because it's not under the current climate regime. You can't foresee that kelp will in fact be healthy enough to continue to feed the urchins in the large areas of these otter removals. I mean, it just seems like we're in such uncharted territory. And maybe it's your last point about the future, right? You learn from the past and where the mistakes were, and you try to go back to that lesson, but you don't know what 2030 looks like.
I hear you. I have so many thoughts to share. I hear you, and I completely agree. Like, we're in no analog state. If there's one thing that all the nations I work with bring up right away is climate resilience and climate. Everyone is so attuned to it. They want us to study it, understand it. We've been doing these crazy experiments, manipulating climate in small spatial scales with nations because they want to know. So I think you're absolutely right. we can't just take what was done in the past and presume that it's going to be useful in the future given climate impacts. But at the same time, remember that thousands of years ago, nations went through the medieval climate anomaly. They went through massive glacial changes. It's still recorded in their oral histories, like the sea level change that the Haida experienced on the southern tip of Haida Gwaii did cause flooding. It happened that quickly. So people in the past did have to deal with extreme climate events. And, when you look at clam gardens now, you just think, wow, not only does it, secure access, but it's stabilizing climate extremes. So I guess I wouldn't dismiss the fact that in the past, people had to deal with climate extremes, for sure, not at the pace and not at the magnitude we're experiencing now. And they care a lot about it. And future proofing management is on the minds of all of the Indigenous managers I work with. They're always asking me, we need to make sure we're future proofing these ideas. And that's why, it came to that egregia story, measuring ocean temperature was so important. Is this actually going to work in the future with the rates of change that they are seeing and experiencing right now? So for sure, when it comes to the mosaic idea, one of the first neat propositions put forward to me when we started talking about this mosaic work was actually by Tim Tinker, who I know many of you probably here know. He was heavily involved with Josh Smith and that beautiful paper in PNAS, right? Yeah, with the mosaic that they described there. I was lucky to serve on the committee there. And one thing Tim Tinker said is, Anne, if this mosaic did exist in the past, which it really probably had to, given the archaeological data, having the diversity of meta communities probably would have really helped when it comes to the spread of disease, for example, which he's probably right? I mean, we will never know for sure, but we can certainly kind of experiment with our models, and we can experiment with practice today with actually trying these things out today. So that's why I stressed earlier adaptive management experiments. I think we have to experiment and try, and then we have to do it very cognitively, understanding the magnitude of changes we face. Even when it comes to kelp restoration, I worry here in BC. I worry about where we choose to do it, given swiftly changing ocean temperatures that we're experiencing here around Vancouver in the Strait of Georgia. It's crazy, but it's not happening as much along the central coast and north coast of BC. So you're right. I think all of the things that we're imagining have to fundamentally be considered within swiftly changing climate context.
Yeah, we're going to have to. And so everyone go ahead and raise your hands. I do got a question from a student. I'm going to go ahead and read it out to you. Thank you for such an insightful talk. And do you have any advice for integrating collaboration and co-participation in your research? And that's from one of our students, Jess Franks.
Thanks, Jess. It's a great question, and it's one I get from a lot of people. And I'm so glad that people are thinking and asking the question. And my biggest answer, I suppose there's so many answers to that question, but the first one is ask. So the fundamental principle that we use when we work with nations is always ask first. Ask what their protocols are for engagement, who are the people that should be consulted and should be asked for that consent, who are the knowledge holders, who are the people, and how should it be done. So I give you back the answer of asking. It can be done in so many different ways. And I suppose the other kind of fundamental principle is having humility. It is easy to think about all of the training we have and the knowledge that we do have, but there's so much that we don't know. And entering in any of these partnerships with that humility is kind of fundamental to building any knowledge co-production relationship. And with that humility comes the skill of listening and talking less and listening more. And then once you do that, that's when you get these little pearls of wisdom that you realize can expand your own understanding of how systems work. And that's where some of the magic comes. So those are a couple of key principles to initiating relationships. There's many more. A lot of people have written about this. It's true that you don't know about it until you do it. And I'll just add one more thing. It is easy to make mistakes, and you will make mistakes, and mistakes happen. But there's a beautiful governance principle held by all of the nations I work with, the Health of the Haida New Channel. They all have a word for it, and it's called making things right. So they have a process. When you make a mistake, if you admit that mistake publicly and you ask, what can I do to make it right? There's always a way to move forward. So it's a bit of a relief, and it's really nice that there's protocols that exist. So there you go. There's a few tips.
Thanks. And I've got a couple more questions. I'm waiting to see if anyone else raises their hand. And until they do so, I'm going to ask an easy one. And I don't know how much of it's a question or not, but as you know, we've got a little expertise in growing seaweeds to eat, and we love our kelps. And if you were to ask me at all, hey, Mike, which is the species of seaweed you'd really never want to farm because it doesn't taste good? You know what it'd be? It'd be feather boa. And how amazing to hear from you that the way to make feather boa edible is to actually cover it with herring roe.
And it is delicious. What they do is they pop those little bladders so that it sinks. So you don't eat the bladders, which I imagine they're a bit tougher, like quite a bit tougher, I think.
The whole thing's tough.
Yeah, but no, I'll tell you what else. Oops, I just lost my little, hang on. Wait, oh no. Malfunction, hang on. Can you guys hear me? I'm going under the desk.
We can still hear you.
You can? Oh,
yeah.
Good. You can still hear me? Okay, good, because I can't find the little earbud. It's down there somewhere. You can hear me. So I'm going to go on and tell you that yagya is usually brined. So once it is put in the water, and it is a huge technique to make sure you're putting it in the right place where the herring are going to spawn. You never know when or where herring are going to spawn. They're the trickiest beast I've ever worked with to experimentally. But when they do, and the nations often, they figure out the signs. You often see a lot of eagles congregating, a lot of sea lions congregating, and they know what's going to happen. And then it happens. So you got to get the lines in the water first before it happens. Then the herring come and they lay their eggs. It's amazing to watch. Those are collected. They also put macrocystis in the water as well as a substrate, and hemlock, tops of hemlock trees. Macrocystis is usually sold commercially. Yagya is kept, and it is traded in big white tubs of brined yagya, and it is also gifted hugely at potlatches. So it is a sign of wealth and health, and it is gifted in community, and it does taste delicious.
That's incredible. So now I'm going to ask one more again until I see a hand raise. I'm going to ask a slightly deeper one, and
okay.
I'm going to conjure up the ghost of one of our mentors, Bob Payne, and ask this one gently in the sense of listening to you today. All I hear is baselines. So we have today's baseline, which is current, right, that we're looking at. And when we talk about things like climate resilience and impacts and fisheries impacts and management, we start to ask, what do we want to restore a system to? How far back do we want to go? Do we want to go back to the 1980s when there seemed to be some kind of balance between consumption and economics, or do we want to go into the 50s where there were these heydays of massive abalone systems in the state of California that fueled a post-colonial cultural fascination with it? Or do we want to go to post-colonial? Or now you're telling us, wait a minute, you want to go pre-colonial, but you could pick 4 different millennia pre-colonial, or do we even pick pre-Kelp Highway, right?
Yeah.
Because pre-Kelp Highway presumably is not human management of coastal otter resources. That is prior to the movement. I mean, whoa. It's like,
Well, okay,
does it
yeah,
become
yeah.
dangerous picking which
Well,
baseline?
I think that I hope I didn't say we have to go back. I think what we do need to do is think carefully about our baselines. But the Maori, for example, have a beautiful proverb, and it's something like um, walking backwards into the future. Like what I'm suggesting is we do need to look back. It's so easy for us to forget the past, and we know of the dangers of sliding baselines. And what I'm getting at here is um, we can't just assume when it comes to kelp that kelp was everywhere, that sea otters were at carrying capacity everywhere. They weren't, right? But it's hard for us because we grow up with these paradigms in our mind. But what I am saying is, as we go into the future, it helps if we know these things from the past, helps us understand the dynamics of what's shaping today. And we still have for sure need to understand the dynamics that are driving things today. And for the future, we certainly need to understand the magnitude of change that's happening. I'm all for projections of um, different climate futures and what that means when it comes to management decisions. So we do need to look forward, but we need to look forward knowing our past. And that's the main message there. I don't think we can ever go back in BC to even, 1,000 years ago. Right now, that image I showed of Ian McKechnie's with all those settlement sites, those don't exist anymore. They're like that picture I showed of the clam garden. They're green patches near forests where several thousands of people, like 1,000 to 2,000 people live there. They don't live there anymore. They live in major town centers. And certainly we do work in remote, beautiful areas up and down the coast, but they're nowhere near as populated as they were 1,000 years ago. And that won't happen because we can't provide the contemporary things that people need to survive, electricity, temperature, and education for kids and that kind of thing. So I don't think we should aim to go back. And what that will mean, which I think you alluded to earlier, which I agree, is that these potential otter-free areas from that first case study, they'll probably be very few, and they'll have to be close to where people actually can, maintain some kind of landscape of fear with direct mortality. And this does happen. There's beautiful papers out of Alaska, some from your colleagues just north of you in Santa Cruz. Kirsty Croker and her student Gora had a beautiful paper in Phil Tranton, Royal Society B, I think, showing what they're doing in Sitka to maintain some of their shellfish beds. So I think that will happen, but nowhere near at the spatial scale that it probably happened to in the past.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's fantastic. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask thank you very much. I'm going to ask the IT group to go ahead and stop the live stream and the recording, and I'm going to allow any of the participants who would just like to unmute and put the video on and say hello for kind of like a powwow until everyone is ready to go. But again, Anne, I just really want to thank you. It's always refreshing. And then once we get the recording off, I got a great story or a question to ask.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
God.
So let's see.